It was Christmas morning. The tree was lit, the coffee was brewing, and I had a gift in my hand wrapped in gold paper tied with a red ribbon. I thought this was just another holiday with my wife, Heather. 11 years of marriage had made me believe I knew what to expect. But when I handed her that gift, she didn't smile. Instead, she reached behind the couch and pulled out an envelope. I opened it. Divorce papers, not a conversation, not a warning, just a signature request. On Christmas morning, Heather looked me straight in the eye and said, "I want the house, the vacation home, and half of your business. My lawyer says it's all mine." What she didn't know, I had been waiting for this moment, planning for it. If you've ever trusted someone only to watch them try to destroy you, stay with me. Because while Heather thought she was taking everything I had, she never stopped to check who actually owned it. And that mistake, it cost her everything. Subscribe now, because this isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about staying 10 steps ahead. Before Christmas morning turned into a battlefield, I was just Christopher Bennett, a real estate developer, 44, living in Phoenix, Arizona. I wasn't flashy. I didn't drive a sports car or wear designer shoes, but I built things: homes, commercial buildings, investments that grew brick by brick from the ground up. And I thought I'd build a life too with Heather. We met at a charity gala hosted by one of my business partners. She was radiant, quick with a joke, charming in a way that pulled people in without trying too hard. She just opened an art consultancy, and she said she was passionate about beautiful things that lasted. That line stuck with me because at the time I thought we were building something beautiful together, something that would last. Within 2 years, we were married. No kids. Heather didn't want children, and honestly, I was okay with that. We poured ourselves into travel, design, entertaining. The house we shared, our desert home, was stunning. Heather picked the finishes, I handled the financing. From the outside, people called us a power couple. But marriage isn't a magazine spread. It's quiet mornings, missed calls, silent dinners. It's wondering why she's always out late and why she no longer tells you where she's going. The cracks showed early. I remember once around year 5 asking Heather if she'd consider taking on a bigger role in the business. She smiled, kissed my cheek, and said, "Business is your thing, Chris. I'm not trying to be the breadwinner." And that's fine, until one day she wanted half the bread. Still, I kept believing. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I earned more, if I made her life easier, we'd get back to those early days. But the more I gave, the more distant she became. What she never noticed was that I had stopped sleeping peacefully years ago. And not because of her, but because I had watched a close friend lose everything in a brutal divorce. Mark had built his company from scratch, and within 6 months of his wife leaving him, he was living in a rental apartment with folding chairs and a court order, draining half his income. That shook me. So I did what people like me do. I planned quietly, carefully with professionals. My family had an estate attorney, an old school guy, who didn't say much but knew how to protect legacy assets. We created a trust. Every major property, the house, the vacation home, my commercial real estate holdings, was moved under the trust's umbrella. I was listed as the beneficiary, not the owner. That's an important detail. The trust itself, established before our wedding, held the titles. Then came the prenup. At the time, Heather called it a formality. She joked about how romantic it wasn't, but she signed it. It stated clearly any asset held by a premarital trust remains separate property. I never flaunted it. I never used it as a threat. I just filed it away and waited. Not because I wanted to leave Heather, but because something told me one day she might try to leave me, and not just leave. Take by year 10, I started noticing little things. A lipstick I'd never seen. A new contact in her phone labeled S. Her laughter drifting through the backyard gate late one night while I stood at the window with the lights off. That night, I didn't go outside. I didn't say a word. I just watched her slip through that gate and disappear into the dark. And I realized then Heather didn't love me anymore, but she still loved what I had. The December Phoenix was colder than usual. Mornings dropped into the 40s, and the desert wind felt sharper somehow. But maybe that was just me walking on edge, waiting for something I couldn't name, but knew was coming. Heather was unusually cheerful that month, overly. So she started cooking again, something she hadn't done in years. She decorated the house like it was our first Christmas together, Candles, pine garlands, even handmade ornaments. She kissed me on the cheek in front of our friends at a holiday dinner party, held my hand in public. To anyone watching, it looked like we were better than ever. But to me, it felt like a countdown. The morning it happened, I had everything prepared. Her gift was wrapped. My coffee was hot. I even wore the sweater she liked, the one with the navy stripes. I handed her the gold-wrapped box across the table. She smiled, but it wasn't real. And then she stood up, walked around the kitchen island, reached into a drawer and pulled out an envelope. She laid it on the table without a word. I looked at it. My name printed neatly across the front inside a divorce petition, already signed, her signature in blue ink. My name left blank. I looked up and she said without blinking, "I want the main house, the cabin in Sedona, and half of your business assets. My lawyer says I'm entitled to all of it." My fingers tightened around the envelope, but my voice didn't rise. I just asked, "Is that everything?" She nodded. "It's all laid out in there." She sipped her tea, calm, cold. For a long moment I said nothing, just stared at her. Not as my wife, but as someone who had rehearsed this moment. Someone who believed she just flipped the chessboard and walked away the winner. But Heather never checked the board. I slid the envelope back toward her, told her I'd let my attorney take it from here, and then I went upstairs, sat on the edge of the bed, and exhaled. Not sadness, not rage. Relief. She'd finally made her move. What Heather didn't know, what her attorney didn't seem to have investigated, was that none of those assets she claimed were technically mine to divide. The house she demanded held in a trust filed years before our marriage, controlled by my family estate. I was the beneficiary. I had access, but no direct ownership. The Sedona vacation property, same structure. Trust held, funded through a separate entity managed by my mother's side of the family. And my real estate company split into two LLCs, both shielded by layered protections, registered under the trust's umbrella, with operating agreements that defined any spousal claims as external interest without standing, in plain English. She couldn't touch it. Not legally, not financially, not even through court order. She thought she knew the rules. She thought being married for over a decade automatically gave her rights. But she forgot about the prenup, forgot about the trust, forgot who she was dealing with. I didn't build my empire by accident, and I didn't leave it vulnerable out of sentiment. That week, I sent everything, trust paperwork, LLC filings, prenup copies, to my attorney. He called me an hour later and said, "She doesn't have a case. This is clean." Heather, meanwhile, was still planning her next chapter. She started telling friends she was about to come into a massive settlement, said she'd be moving to California, starting fresh. And that's when I decided to say something. Just one thing. I asked her gently if she remembered the prenup we signed. She blinked and then said, "Oh, that thing." I nodded. "In the family trust. The one we filed in 2010. She stared at me like I'd spoken a different language. And right there in our kitchen beside a drying Christmas tree, I watched her realize she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. Not because she wanted to leave me, but because she thought I'd just let her take what she never helped build. And suddenly, all that Christmas cheer disappeared. For days after that conversation, Heather avoided me. No more cheerful breakfasts, no more fake smiles. She spent hours locked in her office, probably on the phone with her attorney, trying to make sense of what I had said, trying to find a loophole that didn't exist. I wasn't cruel about it. I didn't gloat. I didn't throw it in her face. But there was no going back now. Not to the marriage. Not to the illusion we'd kept up for years. I remember standing in the doorway of our living room, watching her pace back and forth, phone pressed to her ear, frustration written all over her face. It was the first time I saw Heather truly worried. A week later, her attorney requested a meeting with both of us present. I agreed. I wanted to hear it said out loud. We sat across from each other in a sleek downtown office. Heather was dressed impeccably as always, but there was tension in her posture, a stiffness she couldn't mask. Her lawyer shuffled papers, cleared his throat, and finally spoke. "Mrs. Bennett, after reviewing the documents provided by Mr. Bennett's counsel, it appears that the assets in question are in fact protected by a premarital trust. The prenuptial agreement further supports this separation of property." Heather's eyes darted to me. confusion turning to panic. What about the house, she snapped. The cars, the Sedona property, his company? The lawyer sighed. I'm afraid those are not considered marital assets. Based on the trust structure and the agreements in place, your claims would not hold up in court. It was silent after that. Heather's face drained of color. Her carefully crafted plan, months, maybe years in the making, was crumbling right there on the polished mahogany table. I should have felt triumphant, but I didn't. All I felt was empty because this wasn't a victory. It was confirmation that the woman I once loved had been willing to gut me financially without a second thought. Heather finally broke the silence. So what do I get? She asked, her voice brittle. The attorney glanced at me, then back at her. Your personal belongings, and if both parties agree a modest settlement to expedite the process. Heather looked like she might explode, but there was nothing left to say. When we left that office, she didn't walk beside me. She stormed ahead, heels clicking furiously against the tile floor. That was the last time we ever spoke in person. In the weeks that followed, everything moved quickly. The divorce papers were finalized with minimal negotiation. She accepted a small payout, far less than what she had envisioned, when she served me those papers on Christmas morning. But just when I thought it was over, I decided to deliver one final truth. I sent her a package. No note, no explanation, just a flash drive. On it was a collection of videos taken from the security cameras installed around our property. Footage of Heather late at night slipping through the backyard gate, meeting our neighbor Samuel S. in her phone. There were months' worth of recordings, proof that I had known about her affair long before she handed me that envelope. I never confronted her about it back then, not because I was weak, but because I was patient, because I understood that sometimes silence is the loudest response. I don't know what Heather felt when she watched those videos, but I imagine it was similar to what I felt that Christmas morning. Betrayal shock, and the crushing weight of knowing there's no way back. That was the point of no return for both of us. She lost more than just material things. She lost her reputation, her pride, and the illusion that she was in control. And me, I lost whatever remnants of love I had left for her, but I kept everything else long before Heather handed me those divorce papers. I had already started laying the foundation. Not out of paranoia, but because I'd seen the consequences of not planning. I remembered what happened to Mark, my close friend from grad school. He was a brilliant architect, but when his wife blindsided him with divorce, she walked away with half his firm and 3 of their investment properties. He spent 2 years rebuilding. By the end, he wasn't the same man. So when Heather and I got engaged, I made a decision quietly without drama. I spoke to my family's estate attorney. We drafted a prenup that was generous but firm. Anything held within the Bennett family trust established before the wedding would remain separate property. Heather would have full access to any joint assets we acquired together, but those foundational holdings, untouchable. She signed the prenup without resistance. I remember her laughing and saying, as long as we never split up, it doesn't matter. Anyway, I agreed, but I still filed it, notarized and witnessed. Years later, when our marriage began to show hairline fractures, I didn't push, I didn't accuse. I adjusted, I began reviewing our property deeds. Anything that wasn't already shielded, I moved quietly into trust-protected LLCs. I had the Sedona cabin refinanced under a business entity owned by the trust. The vehicles transferred under business use for the development firm. Even the art in our home, the expensive pieces Heather liked to show off during dinner parties, those were purchased through company funds documented as office decor for promotional use. Every move I made had a paper trail, every dollar I spent was traceable, and none of it could be claimed as marital property. I also started documenting Heather's behavior. Not for court, at least not initially, but for clarity. I kept logs of her nights out, times she claimed to be at yoga or wine tastings, but never posted a thing. I noted odd charges on our joint credit card spa treatments in someone else's name, car rentals, billed to unfamiliar addresses, and when I installed the security cameras, I told her it was for safety. She agreed, didn't even question the motion detectors near the backyard. So when I saw her slipping out to meet Samuel, our neighbor, a man I'd once grilled steaks with, I didn't react. I recorded, I archived, some might call it cold. But to me it was clarity. I didn't want revenge. I wanted truth. And when Heather finally pulled the trigger, when she tried to reduce our life to numbers and split them down the middle, I was ready. I handed everything to my lawyer in one neat labeled binder. He couldn't believe the detail. Ownership charts, copies of prenup clauses, video logs, trust certificates, even screenshots of Heather bragging to her friends over text about cashing out once the divorce was final. We didn't argue. We didn't negotiate. Heather's legal team folded before it even got to court, but I wasn't done. After the divorce was finalized, I sat down and reevaluated everything. I reorganized my real estate firm to include a new division, one focused on education and asset protection. I called it Second Foundation. It offered financial literacy programs for recently divorced individuals, mostly women who'd been left with nothing because they didn't plan. I didn't want others to experience what I had on either side of the table. That part Heather never saw coming. She assumed I'd spend the rest of my life bitter. She assumed she'd broken me. Instead, I expanded. I hired better staff, took on high-end development clients. And within a year, I was speaking at real estate and wealth conferences about legacy planning prenups and how trust law can save your future. One day, a woman came up to me after a seminar. She said her ex-husband had blindsided her the same way Heather tried to blindside me. But after hearing me speak, she was going to set up her own trust for her kids and never leave herself vulnerable again. That meant more than winning any court case. Heather, meanwhile, she left town. Last I heard, Samuel dumped her 6 months after the divorce. Turns out, dating your married neighbor isn't the foundation for a great love story. She tried to sell some designer bags online. I guess the California dreams didn't quite pan out. And me, I kept building, not just buildings, not just wealth, but something better. A life with intention, a career that helps people, and a shield no one could ever again pierce. The day Heather signed the final settlement agreement, there were no tears, no apologies, just silence. We didn't meet in person. Her lawyer sent over the documents electronically, clean, clinical, and far removed from the woman who once promised forever. She took the deal, a small payout enough to cover a few months of rent and whatever plans she thought she could salvage. But I knew Heather, and I knew pride was her most expensive possession. Losing the assets wasn't what crushed her. It was realizing she'd been outplayed by the man she thought was too passive to fight back. The flash drive I sent her a week later was never acknowledged, no call, no message, but I got confirmation it was opened. That was enough for me. I didn't need a confrontation. I didn't need to hear excuses or justifications for the affair. The footage spoke louder than any words could. For Heather, that was the real blow. Knowing I had seen everything. Knowing I had stayed quiet, not out of ignorance, but strategy. She tried to humiliate me on Christmas morning, tried to strip me of everything I'd built. But in the end, she walked away with nothing but a bitter story. She couldn't tell without exposing herself. Word spread quickly among our social circle. People who once admired Heather's elegance began to see through the facade. The dinner invitations stopped. The curated Instagram posts disappeared. And Samuel, he wasn't the safety net she expected. Turns out a man who's willing to sneak around with his neighbor's wife isn't exactly dependable when things get tough. 6 months after the divorce, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Heather had moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of Los Angeles. She was working part-time at an art gallery, nothing like the glamorous life she once flaunted. Meanwhile, my life took a different path. With Second Foundation gaining traction, I found myself busier than ever. But it wasn't just about business anymore. It was about purpose. I started mentoring younger professionals, teaching them how to safeguard their assets, how to separate emotion from financial reality. And somewhere along the way, I met Emily. She wasn't like Heather. Emily was grounded, sharp, and understood the value of transparency. She ran her own real estate consultancy, and from our first conversation, it was clear we spoke the same language. We worked together on a few projects before anything personal developed, but when it did, it felt effortless. No games, no secrets, just two people building something real together. By the time Heather's name faded from conversation, I was already living a life she could never touch. But I never forgot what happened, not out of resentment, but as a reminder. A reminder that trust isn't given freely, it's earned and protected. One evening about a year after everything settled, I received an email. No subject line, no message, just a single attachment, A photo of Heather standing alone outside a cafe, looking lost. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. That image said it all. She had gambled everything on the belief that I was weak, that I was blind, that I would crumble when she struck. But instead, I let her dig her own grave, one misstep at a time. And when the dust settled, I wasn't the man left picking up pieces. I was the one holding the blueprint for a better future. The fallout wasn't just hers. It was a lesson etched into every decision I made moving forward. Never assume loyalty from someone who sees you as a stepping stone. Never confuse silence with surrender, and never ever leave your legacy unguarded. Because in the end, Heather didn't just lose a husband. She lost the game. She didn't even realize she was playing against a man who had already won before the first move was made. It's been 3 years since that Christmas morning, 3 years since Heather tried to rewrite my future with a single envelope. Sometimes I still walk through that old desert house, the one she thought she could claim. But now it feels different, not like a home filled with memories, more like a monument to lessons learned. I've moved on, not just in life, but in mindset. Emily and I built something far stronger than contracts and property lines. We built trust, the kind that doesn't need cameras or legal documents to feel secure. But I'll never regret the steps I took to protect myself back then. Because love, no matter how deep, should never blind you to reality. People ask me all the time at seminars, "Chris, were you angry? Did you ever want revenge?" The truth: no, I didn't need revenge. Heather's downfall wasn't something I orchestrated out of spite. It was the natural consequence of her own choices, a blueprint she drafted when she decided betrayal was easier than honesty. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: preparation isn't paranoia. It's respect for yourself, for your future, and for the hard work you've invested in your life. I share my story now, not to boast, but to warn. Trust but verify, love but protect. And never assume that just because someone shares your bed, they share your vision. Heather thought marriage was a safety net. I knew it was a partnership with clear boundaries. In the end, she walked away empty-handed because she never understood the value of what she didn't contribute to. And me, I walked away with peace, not because I won some legal battle, but because I refused to let bitterness define me. So if you're listening to this, wondering if you should prepare for the worst while hoping for the best, the answer is yes, because real strength isn't in how loud you fight back. It's in how quietly you protect what matters most, long before anyone tries to take it.